Picture this. It's 2:00 a.m. in ancient Rome. The moon glows over crumbling aqueducts. Your neighbor's donkey is braying again. Your slave keeps shuffling outside your door, and your body itches from whatever was in the communal bath today. You haven't slept in 3 nights, and your only option is wine, prayer, or counting amphorae. Yes, insomnia existed long before blue light. Turns out the Romans were just as sleep-deprived, neurotic, and hopelessly human as we are, minus the blackout curtains. And oh, their solutions. Let's just say, sleep wasn't their strong suit. Still tossing and turning? Hit that like button before you try ancient lettuce water therapy. Subscribe for more disturbingly relatable tales of history's worst sleep hygiene. Your melatonin can wait. Let's set the scene. It's midnight in ancient Rome. And no, that does not mean peaceful marble courtyards and the gentle hum of crickets. It means chaos. It means clanging iron wagon wheels echoing off stone alleys, dogs howling like they just saw Caesar's ghost, and someone, probably your upstairs neighbor, practicing poetry out loud again. Shirtless. You're in a insula, a rickety, multi-family apartment building, stacked like a loaf of burnt lasagna. It's made mostly of creaking wood, dreams, and the constant threat of collapse. If one tenant knocks over a lamp, the whole place could go up like a human barbecue, which is a nice thought to drift off to sleep with, right? Now imagine trying to get some showtime in that delightful scenario. Your bed is essentially a rope net stretched over splinters. Your blanket is scratchier than a gossip forum in the Senate. And your pillow? Oh, that's just a sack of old linen that smells vaguely of goat and regret. Add in a chorus of whispering neighbors, stomping footsteps, and the ambient aroma of boiled cabbage seeping through the walls, and voila, welcome to your Roman bedtime. Rome was many things. Imperial, magnificent, brutally efficient, but quiet? Never. Peaceful? Absolutely not. If anything, nighttime in ancient Rome was like living next to a Colosseum that never quite shut down. The city didn't sleep. It paced. It muttered. It shifted uncomfortably under the weight of its own grandeur and sewage systems. Here's the funny part, or tragic, or both. You'd think that without smartphones, late-night TikTok scrolling, or the existential horror of email, Romans would sleep better than we do, right? No artificial light, no office deadlines, just sun up, sun down, like the gods intended. And yet, they didn't. Not really. Ancient Rome had a problem. A sleepy, twitchy, bone-deep kind of problem. Insomnia was rampant, especially in the cities. People couldn't rest. They couldn't stay asleep. They couldn't stop worrying, couldn't stop thinking, couldn't stop being Roman long enough to let their bodies shut down. And no, there wasn't a Latin word for melatonin. There was just wine. Lots and lots of wine. Let's talk about the architecture of the sleepless. Because if you were poor, which statistically speaking you were, your entire family lived in 1 or 2 rooms, one shared sleeping space. You, your partner, your kids, your aging mother-in-law, your cousin who's just visiting and never left, and a bucket in the corner that no one wants to talk about, all snoring, coughing, shifting, sighing, and occasionally groaning in what can only be described as aggressively audible dreams. Above you, another family doing the exact same thing. Below you, the building's one baker getting up at midnight to start the day's loaves. And outside your window, a donkey. Always a donkey. So yeah, breathe that in, dust and all. Now if you had a few more coins in your toga, maybe you could afford a private room, a curtain, even a slave to fan you while you sweat through your 4th dream about being stabbed in the Senate. But that didn't mean better sleep. It just meant more elaborate insomnia. The rich didn't rest easier. They just had fancier nightmares. Because even in the quietest corners of Rome, there was still noise. Psychological noise. Anxiety, fear of debt, of political failure, of divine punishment, of waking up to find the river gods had flooded your wine cellar again. And the gods? Oh, the gods were no help. They didn't exactly specialize in REM cycles. There was Somnus, sure, the Roman god of sleep, but praying to him was like whispering to your mattress and hoping it replies. Most Romans didn't even bother. If they were awake at night, they assumed the gods were punishing them, or testing them, or just bored. So they lay there, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, listening to the mice have loud marital disputes in the walls, and wondering, not for the first time, if the entire empire was built on one big, collective case of exhaustion. Because it wasn't just the individuals. The whole societas romana was chronically underslept. Soldiers, farmers, priests, merchants, even the emperors, especially the emperors. But we'll get to them later. Rome was in essence an insomniac civilization, a place where sleep was viewed as weakness, and ambition, that tireless Roman virtue, was something to be sharpened at 3 a.m. while pacing barefoot across a mosaic floor. And here's the kicker. Romans didn't even measure time like we do. Their night was divided into vigilia, 4 shifts of guard duty, each lasting 3 hours. That's right, the concept of 8 glorious hours of uninterrupted sleep, a modern luxury. In Rome, you got 3 hours max before someone changed the watch, or your neighbor's kid started playing the flute again. Which begs the question, was sleep just another battle to be won? Another thing to conquer? Because if everyone's tired, no one's weak. If no one sleeps, no one's falling behind. Right? Maybe sleeplessness wasn't a flaw in the system. Maybe it was a feature. And so, we land on the big question. What if insomnia wasn't just a symptom, but a social currency? Hold that thought, because things are about to get louder. If you thought the problem was just your lumpy mattress or the distant hum of a donkey choir, think again. Ancient Roman insomnia didn't exist in a vacuum. It was nurtured, encouraged, bred in the sweaty crucible of a city that fundamentally hated quiet, and nowhere was this more obvious than in Rome's nighttime social calendar, which frankly was less a calendar and more a non-consensual all-nighter, with wine, fire hazards, and questionable poetry. Let's start with the basics. The Romans loved to party, and not in the have a nice dinner and be home by 10 kind of way. No, think more. 12-course feasts, slurred philosophical debates, off-key lyre performances, and someone throwing up into a priceless amphora, all by torchlight, all audible from 5 blocks away. This wasn't just for the elite. Sure, senators and wealthy patricians had the biggest, rowdiest banquets, where the wine flowed faster than water ever did through Rome's plumbing. But the lower classes didn't exactly meditate at sunset either. Taverns, brothels, gambling dens, all of them stayed open deep into the night, welcoming citizens, freedmen, and the occasional goat. Because goats apparently were difficult to evict. Even the streets had a nightlife of their own. Vendors hawked food well past sundown. Beggars performed impromptu tragedies for spare coins. Thieves prowled like they had tenure, and if you happened to stumble into the wrong alley, well, let's just say Rome's version of nightlife could occasionally involve a dagger and a poorly lit obituary. But if you think noise pollution was just a symptom of fun, think again. Roman cities weren't built with the concept of soundproofing. The walls between units in an insula were thinner than a toga on wash day. One poet, one screaming baby, one argument about olive prices. That's all it took, and the city was crawling with insomniacs trying to outshout each other. Enter Pliny the Younger, a Roman author, statesman, and the first known sufferer of "my neighbor is an artist" syndrome. In a letter to a friend, he vents, with almost divine pettiness, about being kept awake by loud poets reciting their work in the streets. And not just occasionally, regularly, because apparently poetic ambition peaked around Imagine that. You're lying in bed, praying to Somnus for mercy, when some toga-clad hipster starts shouting bad elegies about unrequited love beneath your window. No wonder half the empire was cranky. And it wasn't just poetry. Rome had actual night courts. That's right. Legal hearings held in the dark. Magistrates, often bribed, sometimes drunk, resolving disputes while the rest of the city tried to sleep. One man's justice was another man's insomnia. Let's also not forget the religious festivals. Romans celebrated basically everything. A decent harvest? Feast. Someone's birthday? Feast. Mercury didn't crash the economy this week? Feast. And some of these religious events, like the Lemuria, took place specifically at night, because why honor your ancestors when you can accidentally summon them at 1 a.m. with barley and black beans? Even those trying to avoid the chaos couldn't escape it. Apartment buildings often overlooked narrow streets that became echo chambers, the clatter of horseshoes on stone, the creak of wagon wheels, the shouts of drunkards arguing over who invented wine. All of it amplified and bounced straight into your skull. And if you were a decent Roman trying to follow the law, say, not making noise, not holding wild banquets, not loudly reciting poetry, you still suffered, because your neighbors weren't. Rome, by its very layout, made other people's bad decisions your bedtime playlist. Still watching? Then you know what to do. Hit that button. You're practically part of the night watch by now. But let's zoom out for a second. This wasn't just noise. This was culture. The Romans didn't see nighttime as downtime. They saw it as more time, more hours to climb the social ladder, to impress, to seduce, to outdrink your enemies, and memorize laws, just in case you accidentally become emperor tomorrow. Night was opportunity, and for a city obsessed with control, conquest, and performance, sleep didn't just seem unproductive, it seemed suspicious. Why close your eyes when your rival might still be awake, planning, plotting, writing bad poetry? So, the city pulsed through the night, powered by anxiety, competition, and fermented grapes. And the real tragedy. The human body didn't care. Romans still got tired, still collapsed at their desks, still dragged themselves through mornings like reluctant gladiators summoned for one more round. And slowly, that became the norm. Sleeplessness became virtue. Being seen awake at all hours was admirable. A sign of discipline, energy, ambition, while sleeping in, lazy, un-Roman, possibly Greek. Let that sink in. We often imagine the past as slower, simpler, quieter. But in Rome, the night wasn't a time to rest. It was just another shift in the great performance of public life. Which brings us to a thought. What happens when a society treats nighttime not as sanctuary, but as stage? What happens when rest becomes rebellion? Because under the lamplight, beyond the noise and the shouting and the poetry, there were always a few who didn't join the party, who closed their shutters, who whispered to their children, who lay awake, not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't help it. And that's where we're headed next. Because sleep in Rome wasn't just hard to come by. It was designed to be difficult. So, you've somehow survived the Roman block party that is every single night. You've dodged poets, drunkards, festival goers, and maybe even a pickpocket or two dressed like Mercury. Now, the streets are finally quieting. The last torch has sputtered out. It's time to wind down, to relax, to tuck yourself in and drift gently into a blissful Roman slumber. Yeah, no, that's not how this works. Let's talk about the Roman bedtime routine, a phrase I use with the same irony as gently used chariot or subtle Roman fashion. Because in truth, sleep prep in the ancient world was less about comfort and more about survival. Imagine if every night felt like camping indoors while fending off minor plagues. First, the bedroom. If you were rich, you got a cubiculum, a private sleeping room, often windowless, usually small, and occasionally full of statues that stared at you while you slept. Fun. If you were middle class or poor, you had a corner, a literal corner, maybe behind a curtain if you were fancy, possibly shared with your in-laws, children, or anyone else who hadn't been kicked out for snoring. And the bed? Oh boy. Forget memory foam. Forget springs. Forget comfort. Roman beds were wooden frames with rope lattices, covered by a mattress that was, essentially, a lumpy bag of hay, straw, or if you were truly unlucky, old feathers. The ropes sagged, the hay poked, and the entire thing creaked like a dying senator every time you shifted your weight. Pillows? Imagine someone filled a rag with laundry lint, then beat it flat with a scroll of Livy. That was your headrest. Now, let's get cozy. In a room that probably didn't have heating. Central heating existed, yes, but only in wealthier homes. Everyone else relied on layers. Not plush duvets, not fleece. No itchy, scratchy wool blankets. Often shared. And let's not forget, these were also not laundered often. So, along with warmth, you got the added bonus of fleas, bed bugs, and a light sprinkling of communal skin cells. Next came the nightly prayers. Romans believed in protecting the liminal spaces, those between night and day, life and death, dream and reality, which meant you might have lit a small oil lamp, mumbled to Somnus, the god of sleep, or offered a few crumbs to your household gods in the hope they'd let you rest without haunting your dreams. Also, if you were the superstitious type, and let's be honest, most Romans were, you might have tied a protective amulet around your wrist. whispered charms to ward off night demons, or hung a phallic talisman above your bed, for protection. Naturally. But wait, we're not done. You're finally in bed. You've performed the rituals, you've swaddled yourself in something between a toga and a wool straitjacket, and you're ready to pass out. Except the air is thick, the room smells like smoke from the neighbor's fire, your mattress has taken on the texture of a potato sack, and the communal chamber pot in the corner has begun to express itself. So you lie there, awake, wondering how this is normal. And the truth is, it was. Romans weren't aiming for 8 hours of blissful sleep. Most of them didn't even expect uninterrupted sleep. Instead, they practiced something we now call segmented sleep, sleeping in 2 chunks, with a period of wakefulness in between. You'd doze off after sundown, sleep for a few hours, wake up sometime after midnight, and either pray, think, talk, write, have a snack, or depending on your marriage, engage in marital diplomacy. Then you'd go back to sleep until dawn. In modern terms, it's like getting up at 2 a.m. to check your phone, except your phone is a clay lamp and your social feed is just your own thoughts and maybe a passing rat. Let's also talk about who got to sleep first. In many households, especially larger ones, sleep was hierarchical. Masters first, then family, then servants, then slaves. Some slaves weren't allowed to sleep until everyone else was in bed, just in case someone needed water, or a foot rub, or to loudly dictate a letter to their rival. One unlucky soul might have had the job of keeping the fire going all night. Another might have slept lightly near the door, just in case of burglars, and still others, especially in wealthier homes, were expected to sleep standing by, just outside their master's room, ready to run an errand, or chase away a nightmare, literally. So when we say bedtime routine, we really mean a loose assemblage of discomfort, superstition, body odor, awkward family dynamics, and the ever-present threat of catching something you didn't fall asleep with. Sound restful? And yet, they did sleep. Somehow, through the creaks and groans, through the dreams and the duties, through the scratchy blankets and stern-faced statues, Romans still managed to close their eyes and drift into the abyss. Was it good sleep? No. Was it hygienic? Definitely not. But it was Roman. Purposeful. Structured. A little dramatic, and absolutely indifferent to your comfort. So next time you fluff your memory foam pillow, slide under your 600 thread count sheets, and turn on your white noise machine, just remember, the average Roman would have called that divine luxury, and they'd still wake up with a crick in their neck and a poem recited outside their window, because that, dear viewer, was Roman rest. A ritual, a performance, and sometimes, when the gods were kind, a little sleep. So, you're Roman. You've survived the party, the noise, the creaky bed, and the shared family blanket that smells like damp wool and regret. You're lying there, awake, again, wondering what's wrong with you. Spoiler, it's not you, it's Rome. But still, the question haunts you like the ghost of your neighbor's singing career. Why can't you sleep? Well, don't worry. Ancient Rome had remedies. And by remedies, we mean a dazzling buffet of superstition, pseudoscience, herbal guesswork, and the occasional poultry-related crime scene. Let's dive into it. First up, lettuce. Yes, lettuce. The Romans believed that lettuce, the soggy, boring backbone of Caesar salads, could cure insomnia, not by sleeping on it, though that might have been more comfortable than your rope and hay mattress. No, they consumed it. A salad before bed, or better yet, warm lettuce water, because if there's one thing more soothing than a lullaby, it's sipping broth that tastes like the disappointment of a sad lunch. The idea was that lettuce cooled the body and relaxed the mind, and in fairness, modern science suggests there may have been a hint of truth here. Lettuce contains lactucarium, a mild sedative, though probably not enough to knock you out, unless you were drinking an entire amphora of the stuff, which, let's be honest, someone probably did. Next, poppy. Ah yes, good old Papaver somniferum. The Romans knew that poppies had sleep-inducing properties, so they infused poppy into wine, or oil, or ointments they smeared on the temples. Sounds lovely. Until you remember this is basically ancient DIY opium, with no safety standards and a healthy disregard for dosage. 1 cup might relax you, 2 might have you meeting Pluto in person. Still, if you were rich and desperate, poppy wine was a popular option. If you were poor and desperate, you drank whatever was fermenting behind the latrine and hoped for the best. Now for the truly committed, amulets and charms. If you couldn't sleep, maybe it was the fault of malevolent spirits, or the evil eye, or that thing you said to your cousin last Saturnalia. Enter the talisman industry, a booming side hustle for priests, quacks and crafty neighbors. They'd sell you carved bone pendants, phallic figurines, engraved stones, or herbs wrapped in linen to place under your pillow. Some charms were specific. Wear this one to prevent dreams about betrayal. That one, to keep demons from crawling into your ears. Another one, to stop your dead uncle from visiting again. He doesn't approve of your life choices. And then there were incantations. Romans were surprisingly chill about mixing medicine and magic. So if you were tossing and turning, you might recite a little spell, something rhythmic, almost poetic, usually in Latin, sometimes in Greek, occasionally made up on the spot. Bonus points if you did it while spinning around 3 times, lighting a candle, and sacrificing a small bird. Yes, really, the Romans loved sacrificing things. Chickens, mostly, or pigeons if times were tough. Offer the gods a bird, ask for a dreamless sleep, and hope no one notices you've stolen it from the neighbor's coop, because nothing says good night like avian homicide. But what if you weren't into lettuce, poppies, or poultry blood? Then you bathed. Not just because hygiene is nice, but because warm water was believed to soothe the humors. Roman bathhouses stayed open late, partly because they were social hubs, but also because a good soak was the ancient equivalent of chamomile tea. Steam, silence, slight chance of theft, truly relaxing. The problem, of course, is that once you left the bath and walked home barefoot in the dark, dodging potholes and drunk philosophers, the calm usually wore off. Some remedies were purely behavioral. Philosophers, like Seneca, recommended clearing the mind before sleep. Write in your journal. Confess your wrongs. Forgive your enemies. Try not to spiral into existential dread. Essentially stoic CBT before sleep. Revolutionary stuff. Unless your neighbor interrupts with a lute solo. Others swore by stargazing. Climb the stairs. Stare up at the constellations. Contemplate your place in the universe. The silence might help. Or it might just make you more aware that you're a tiny, aging speck in a collapsing empire. Your mileage may vary. Still others opted for something even simpler. Walking. Not fast. Not with purpose. Just pacing the garden. Up and down. Letting the body tire itself out. Of course, if you didn't have a garden, your pacing happened inside your insula, where the creaky floors made your neighbors believe you were possessed. And then, there were the truly absurd. One Roman remedy advised that if you couldn't sleep, you should rub mouse fat on your feet. Yes, mouse fat. For what purpose? No one knows. Perhaps the logic was, you'll be so disgusted, so distracted, that your brain will give up and just shut off. Or maybe the gods were pranksters. Either way, if you ever hear someone complain about melatonin not working, just whisper, "Have you tried rodent grease?" So, what have we learnt? Roman sleep therapy was a chaotic mix of mildly effective herbology, heartfelt superstition, and completely unhinged nonsense. A typical Roman insomniac might have tried 4 or 5 of these remedies in a single night, layering wine, prayers, pacing, and amulets like some kind of sleep-deprived wizard desperately trying to hack the system. And maybe for some, it worked. Maybe the ritual itself was the cure. The slow rhythm of preparation. The belief that sleep could be summoned. The act of doing something. But here's the twist. What if insomnia wasn't a medical issue? What if it was moral? A sign you had unconfessed guilt? A sign the gods were displeased? A reminder that you hadn't lived virtuously, hadn't honored your ancestors, hadn't followed the mos maiorum, the customs of your people. In that case, no amount of lettuce or lotion would help, because your insomnia wasn't in your body, it was in your soul. By now you've probably noticed a pattern. No one in Rome is sleeping well. Not the poets, not the plebeians, not even the guy hawking fried dormice at midnight. But surely, the powerful rested easy. Right? The ones with the villas, the marble beds, the legions of servants and the best mattresses denarii could buy. Wrong. If anything, Rome's most powerful citizens were the most sleep-deprived of all. Welcome to the glamorous insomniac world of senators and emperors, a place where anxiety wore a laurel crown, and nightfall didn't signal rest. It signaled strategy. Let's start with Julius Caesar. The man, the myth, the walking Red Bull. He reportedly slept no more than 4 hours a night. Not because he was too busy binge-watching his ego, though fair, but because he couldn't stop working. He'd scribble letters in the dark, dictate memos while half-dressed, and even take meetings during his bath. It wasn't a schedule, it was a stress response with a title. Augustus wasn't much better. The first emperor of Rome spent most nights mentally rehearsing every decision he'd ever made, pacing his halls, asking his slaves to read to him so he could fall asleep, only to interrupt them constantly to clarify tax law. Imagine needing a bedtime story and instead requesting a summary of imperial grain reserves. Even Nero, the night owl's night owl, didn't sleep so much as wander. He'd perform songs for hours into the night, force guests to listen, then demand feedback. Genuinely believed sleep was beneath him. He once threw a fit because someone yawned during his midnight harp solo. Classic overachiever behavior. If overachievers also burned down half the city and blamed Christians and the senators, they weren't exactly curling up with bedtime scrolls. They lay awake stewing in paranoia, calculating political alliances, wondering who was plotting to stab them, metaphorically, or sometimes literally. If you fell asleep at the wrong time in Rome, you could wake up exiled, bankrupt, or mysteriously drowned in the Tiber. Senator Lucius Piso, for instance, famously suffered from insomnia during his campaign to restore senatorial dignity. He believed enemies were watching him through the walls, and he wasn't entirely wrong. Rome's political scene was like Survivor, if everyone had daggers and trust issues. There's a specific kind of insomnia that comes from power, the kind where you can't rest because rest feels like negligence, where sleep is betrayal. These men weren't just leaders, they were symbols, and if the symbol snoozes, what does that say about the Republic, or the Empire, or your personal brand? So they pushed through, working late, planning, praying, manipulating, and hoping that if they stayed just a little more alert than everyone else, they wouldn't be the next name carved into a memorial column. But even when they wanted sleep, they weren't always granted it. Enter stress dreams. Ancient texts describe dreams sent from the gods. Ominous symbols, grotesque visions, twisted omens. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, famously dreamed of his assassination the night before it happened. And while Caesar ignored it, plenty of Roman leaders did take their dreams seriously. So seriously that they hired professional interpreters to analyze them. Imagine waking up drenched in sweat because you dreamed of a bleeding goat, then immediately calling in your haruspex to ask if that means you should invade Gaul or break up with your mistress. This was a typical Tuesday for someone like Tiberius. These weren't peaceful dreamers. They were men wired to fear the future, haunted by guilt, ego, and the terrifying possibility that their barber might also be a spy. Still, insomnia wasn't just a curse. Sometimes, it was a flex. A sleepless senator could claim discipline, commitment, a willingness to suffer for the people. Never mind the eye bags. Insomnia was the price of greatness, just another mark of Roman virtue, like courage, self-restraint, or not crying when stabbed in the Senate. Let's pause here. Can ambition ever sleep? Can you rule the known world and get 8 hours a night? Or does power demand you stay awake, watching, worrying, plotting, while the rest of the city dreams beneath you? The irony, of course, is that these were the men who could most afford comfort. They had the nicest beds, the quietest rooms, the finest linens, and yet they tossed and turned, not because they lacked sleep aids, but because they lacked peace. That's the Roman tragedy. The more powerful you became, the more sleep you surrendered. You weren't just leading an empire, you were carrying it, in your bloodstream, in your bladder, in the crushing silence between torchlight and dawn. And so, Rome's leaders stayed up. They read, they wrote, they paced, they stewed, they did everything but rest. So far, we've blamed the noise, the beds, the parties, the politics. Fair. All very reasonable culprits in Rome's ongoing war against sleep. But we're missing one thing, or rather, one pantheon of things. Because in ancient Rome, if you couldn't sleep, it wasn't just a health problem, it was divine drama. Welcome to the spiritual side of insomnia, where every twitch, nightmare, and sleepless night might mean that the gods are watching, and not in a cozy, comforting Hallmark angel sort of way, more like a Jupiter saw you skip your offering and now your dreams are haunted by bleeding goats kind of vibe. Let's begin with the big player, Somnus, the Roman god of sleep. Not a household name, perhaps, but a deity nonetheless, son of Nox, night, brother of Mors, death, because sleep and death were considered disturbingly close roommates, and father to a whole crew of dream spirits called the Somnia. Sounds dreamy, right? Not exactly. Somnus wasn't widely worshipped, at least not in the mainstream temples. He was more of a fringe god, the kind you turned to when you were desperate. Think late-night infomercial deity. His temple, yes, he had one, was said to be located in a cave, shrouded in fog, near the river Lethe. The cave had no doors, no noise, no light, just poppies and silence. Honestly, it sounds like an ASMR spa, crossed with a crypt. Romans who sought out Somnus weren't looking for a nap, they were looking for answers. Because sleeplessness wasn't just inconvenient, it could be interpreted as punishment. A warning, a celestial memo that you'd screwed something up. Had you failed to honor your ancestors, neglected your household gods, lied under oath, forgotten to sacrifice a goat on Mercury's feast day because you were too busy being stabbed in the Senate, then you might find yourself wide awake at night, sweating through your linens while visions of snakes, floods, and disapproving deities danced through your skull. The Romans had an entire infrastructure for dreams and divine sleep interference. Priests called augurs and haruspices, yes, the liver-reading guys, would interpret your night visions. They believed that dreams were direct messages from the gods, coded, symbolic, often cryptic, like divine subtweets. You dream about falling into a river, that's Neptune telling you to pay your taxes. You dream about your teeth falling out, that's Mars warning you about betrayal. You dream about your ex, Venus is just being messy. People took this seriously. So seriously, that dream interpretation became its own genre of literature. There were dream manuals, full-length scrolls that categorized symbols and their meanings. Think of it like Roman WebMD, but with fewer disclaimers and way more fire omens. And if you weren't getting dreams at all, that was also a problem. You might have offended a god so thoroughly they cut you off entirely. No dreams, no sleep, just an endless night of divine silence, ghosted by Olympus. Nightmares, on the other hand, were basically performance reviews. You dreamed of being chased by wolves. Jupiter thinks you're spineless. You dreamed of your own funeral. Pluto's just poking around early. Nightmares could inspire panic, pilgrimages, entire temple renovations. The average Roman didn't ask what did it mean. They asked, how expensive will this be to fix? Let's not forget the demons. Oh yes. Rome, like many ancient cultures, had its own version of night terrors. Malevolent spirits who attacked in the dark. Chief among them was Incubus, a sleep demon known for sitting on your chest and giving you dreams that were, let's say, NSFW, or just terrifying. He later inspired the word incubation, but in Rome he mostly inspired people to sleep with one eye open and a dagger under their straw pillow. And then there were the lemures, restless dead souls who hadn't been properly buried or honored. If they showed up in your dreams or disturbed your sleep, it was a big deal. The Romans even held a special festival, Lemuria, to appease these spirits. You'd wake up at midnight, throw black beans over your shoulder, and chant incantations to send them away, which sounds like witchcraft but was actually just Tuesday. Let that sink in. For Romans, sleep wasn't a break from reality, it was reality, just with worse lighting and more divine commentary. The line between dreaming and prophesying was thin. Night was porous, full of gods and ghosts and the occasional spectral chicken. And this wasn't limited to the superstitious masses. Emperors, philosophers, generals, they all believed. Cicero wrote about prophetic dreams. Scipio Africanus claimed he dreamed of his own military success before the Battle of Zama. Romans didn't dream for fun, they dreamed for insight, instruction, and just enough existential dread to ruin their whole week. Which raises the question, was any Roman sleep actually restful? Or was it just another battlefield? Spiritual, psychological, sacred? Because if every dream was a warning, and every silence a judgment, then every night was a test. A divine interrogation conducted through the veil of sleep. And you? You were just hoping to make it through, without needing a priest, a liver, and a new set of amulets. Now that we've thoroughly blamed the gods for your insomnia, along with your bed, your neighbor, and possibly that cursed bean you forgot to throw, it's time to shift focus. Because even if you wanted to sleep, and the gods were feeling generous, and your neighbor finally shut up about his poetry, there was still one massive, unavoidable problem. Other people had jobs, night jobs. Unseen, thankless, loud, and absolutely not conducive to sleep jobs. Rome, like any great city, didn't shut down after sunset. It just changed gears. While the upper crust tried to drift into divine dreams and the philosophers stared at ceilings in existential angst, an entirely different workforce came to life. One that didn't have the luxury of tossing and turning. Let's start with the Vigilus, Rome's fire brigade and unofficial night police. They were responsible for patrolling the city after dark, putting out fires, maintaining order, and probably breaking up the occasional illegal dice game behind the bakery. Imagine being roused from your hay mattress by the sound of armored sandals and a guy shouting everything is fine, while actively dragging a burning cart down the street. The vigils worked in rotating shifts, broken into 3-hour blocks. They weren't just night owls, they were mandated insomnia professionals. Their job was to stay alert, to keep moving, and most importantly, to make sure other people's insomnia didn't become everyone's problem. Fire was a constant threat. The wooden insula went up like dry brush, and once one floor caught, the rest followed. Quickly, dramatically, and with zero regard for your family heirlooms. And then there were the street cleaners. Not an organized sanitation department, mind you, just underpaid laborers, and enslaved people tasked with sweeping human waste, horse dung, and assorted festival leftovers into piles that hopefully wouldn't clog the drains again. They worked by lamplight barefoot, surrounded by rats the size of chihuahuas. Their brooms were twigs tied together with twine. Their reward, not dying of tetanus. Still awake? Let's talk bakers. Roman bread wasn't just a staple, it was a religion, and it had to be ready at sunrise. Which meant bakers, their apprentices, and the unfortunate souls forced to fuel their ovens were already hard at work by midnight, grinding grain, kneading dough, stoking fires that heated up entire tenement blocks. You ever tried sleeping while someone is hammering stone mills 2 floors below you? It's like living above a construction site that smells vaguely of sourdough and soot. Bakers were often slaves or freedmen, which meant their nights weren't optional. Your master wants bread. You make it. Tired? Try kneading faster. Hungry? Steal a crust and risk a beating. Bread was Rome's great equalizer, but the people who made it lived lives completely alien to the senators, waxing poetic about dreams. Among these nocturnal toilers, perhaps the most invisible and most tragic were the domestic slaves. In large households, slaves often had split shifts. That meant they slept in scraps, an hour here, a few minutes there, always half awake, always alert. Some were expected to rise when their master so much as turned in bed. Others were tasked with keeping lamps lit through the night. Constant flame, constant duty. Let me introduce you to someone. His name is Gaius. He's 15. Enslaved since age 7. Born in Gaul, sold in Rome. His job is to relight the hallway torches in a wealthy merchant's home. Every time one flickers, Gaius gets up, pads barefoot through marble halls, adjusts the wick, breathes life back into the flame. He does this 20, maybe 30 times a night. He's learned not to cough, not to speak, not to be seen. If he does his job right, no one remembers he exists. Gaius hasn't slept through the night since he was 9. So when we talk about Roman sleep culture, it's worth asking, whose sleep are we talking about? Because for every patrician snoring through a poppy-induced dream, there were dozens of gawasses, children, laborers, watchmen, whose nights were sacrificed for someone else's comfort. The insomnia of the elite was poetic, noble, even philosophical. The insomnia of the working class. It was just work, and that work didn't stop at sunrise. Many of these night workers transitioned straight into daytime labor, washing, hauling, carrying. There was no shift differential, no overtime, no sympathy, just exhaustion baked deep into their bones, masked by silence, routine, and the knowledge that rest wasn't part of their job description. Let that settle for a second, because even if the city quieted, they didn't. Sleep was a luxury. not a right, and in Rome, luxuries were unevenly distributed. Still watching? You know what to do. Like, subscribe, and offer a nod of appreciation to the ancient equivalent of the graveyard shift. So what do we take from all this? That insomnia wasn't just a personal failing. It wasn't always divine punishment. Sometimes it was the cost of someone else's peace. Sometimes it was structural, economic, brutal. Sometimes it was Gaius, eyelids heavy, flame flickering, praying that just once the torches might stay lit till morning. You finally fall asleep. Miraculous. Your eyelids surrender, the donkey next door stops braying, and for a fleeting moment, your body gives in to the ancient Roman night. And then it happens. You dream. In vivid color, no less. You're standing in a field of figs, holding a bleeding amphora, and your dead uncle is yelling at you in perfect Etruscan. You wake up, drenched in sweat, convinced the underworld is trying to bill you for unpaid offerings. Welcome to the twisted world of Roman dream logic, where nothing is random, everything is significant, and absolutely no one is sleeping well ever again. In Rome, dreams weren't just subconscious meanderings. They were divine telegrams, psychological carrier pigeons, fully produced metaphysical stage plays, directed by the gods, and starring your guilt, fears, and unresolved family drama. Dreams were serious business. So serious, in fact, that there were professional dream interpreters, connectors, who made a full living decoding your nightly weirdness. People would hire them to figure out whether that dream about swimming in olive oil meant prosperity, indigestion, or both. There were also dream books. Big ones. Entire scrolls filled with indexed symbols. Dreamt of losing your teeth? That meant a relative would die. Dreamt of a snake? Could be fertility, could be betrayal, depends on whether the snake was hissing, coiled, or wearing a little helmet. Dream interpretation in Rome was less science and more performance art. And it went deep. The philosopher Artemidorus wrote a 5-volume dream manual called One Aero Critica, filled with detailed analyses and case studies. He categorized dreams by type: prophetic, diagnostic, erotic, warning-based, revenge-seeking, and miscellaneous nightmare fuel. In a society obsessed with control, dreams were the one area where chaos snuck in. So naturally they had to control those too. Take the example of Emperor Augustus. He famously once changed the outcome of a military campaign based on a dream he had. A dream in which he saw himself being crowned with laurel by a glowing child. Was it propaganda? Possibly. Was it Augustus believing his bedtime visions were state policy? Also very possible. Or consider the story of Publius Aelius, a Roman merchant who dreamed of being bitten by a two-headed wolf while arguing with his father. He immediately cancelled his business trip, offered sacrifices to Mars and Apollo, and later claimed he'd narrowly avoided being robbed by bandits on that very route. Coincidence? Sure. But in Rome, that's not a word anyone trusted. Dreams could impact everything. Marriage decisions, political moves, legal outcomes. You could literally be acquitted in court if your dream suggested innocence. Conversely, you might be exiled if your opponent claimed you dreamed of the emperor dying, which by the way was seen as seditious at best, prophetic treason at worst. Of course, not every Roman dream was laced with epic symbolism. Some were just straight up bizarre. One senator dreamt that he had turned into a loaf of bread. Another believed he saw his house float away on a cloud made of bees. Yet another claimed to have spoken to Cicero's ghost, who told him to invest in brick production, the economic advice of the dead, not found in any modern dream app. And then there was the fig thing. Dreaming of figs, according to some ancient sources, could mean one of two things: fortune or an impending betrayal, which really narrows it down. So you'd wake up, avoid everyone for 3 days, and pray the figs weren't a metaphor for your spouse's side hustle in treason. Let's pause. Freud would have had an absolute field day with this. Except instead of couches and cigars, he'd be wading through incense, sacrificial entrails, and metaphorical chickens. But here's the kicker. Romans didn't just analyze dreams. They acted on them. They built temples because of dreams. They avoided certain dates. They rewrote wills. They made sacrifices to appease whichever deity seemed to be invading their sleep. And if that didn't work, they doubled down. The belief was this: if you ignored a dream, you were ignoring the gods. And if the gods thought you were ignoring them, they'd escalate. Your bad dream becomes a worse dream, becomes a sleepless night, becomes a divine sign that only the most expensive possible offering can fix, like a very passive-aggressive customer service department with a lightning bolt budget. And just like that, insomnia became not just a problem, but a symptom, a sign that the dream hadn't been resolved, that something in the air, in your soul, in your taxes, was unfinished, unclear. So what do we do with this? Because yes, on the surface it's all a little ridiculous. The dream manuals, the fig omens, the goat-based predictions, but underneath it is something deeply human, the need to find meaning in chaos, the desperation to make sense of the night, the hope that our dreams mean something more than just a poorly timed cheese snack. The Romans dreamed big, and weird, and often, and whether they saw gods or ghosts, or themselves dressed as gladiators marrying a river nymph, they believed those dreams were real enough to reshape reality. And maybe that's the most honest form of insomnia. Lying awake, replaying images you didn't ask for, trying to decode a message you're not sure you understand, trying, above all, to listen. So far, our journey through Rome's sleepless landscape has featured poets, senators, bakers, emperors, fire brigades, demons, and the occasional interpretive fig. But let's take a moment to ask, where are the women? Answer, not sleeping, not even a little. Because in ancient Rome, insomnia wasn't just a matter of bad beds or divine retribution. For women, sleep, like everything else, was political, restricted, and deeply unfair. It was the one thing they were expected to do quietly and obediently, and yet they often got the least of it. Let's meet Livia, not the imperial empress, but a fictional, painfully average Roman woman living in a 2-room insular apartment with her husband, 2 children, and a mother-in-law, whose nighttime cough has recently developed a personality. It's midnight. Livia has just finished cleaning up after the evening meal. Her husband, predictably, is snoring on the floor mat, having consumed too much cheap wine and declared politics to be too stressful for a humble leather worker. He sleeps soundly, loudly, spectacular. Livia lies beside him on the woven mat, covered in a thin wool sheet. One child has already wet himself. The other is chewing on something, possibly a splinter, possibly the last fig from dinner. Her mother-in-law is muttering in her sleep, again, about turnips. Outside, a chorus of cats is yowling. Somewhere in the alley, someone is vomiting. Livia stares at the ceiling and waits for her brain to stop running the day's errands on loop. Roman women weren't just responsible for the household, they were the household. Cooking, cleaning, budgeting, weaving, child-rearing, managing slaves, if they had them. And, if they didn't, doing everything personally. That left very little energy for sleep, but a whole lot of stress to lie awake with. And stress was not a small issue. Roman women were constantly monitored, by society, by neighbors, by the law. A woman's reputation could be destroyed by a rumor whispered at a market stall. Her sleep was light, not just because her mat was thin, but because her margin for error was thinner. And let's talk about childbirth, the most common cause of death for Roman women, and the leading cause of lifelong insomnia. Giving birth was a terrifying prospect, often done at home, with midwives who might or might not be trained, surrounded by relatives who were deeply invested in both the baby's arrival and its gender. Postpartum care? Practically non-existent. If the child lived, congratulations, you now had a squalling, colicky future insomniac of your own. If the child died, grief was handled quietly, privately, and preferably off the record. Either way, the night was no longer your own. Women also bore the brunt of ritual obligations, honoring the lares, keeping the household gods appeased, remembering which feast day required what sacrifice. One wrong step, and you might be blamed for your husband's business failing or your neighbor's goat limping. And yes, that anxiety followed you into bed, even when women were wealthy. Sleep wasn't guaranteed. Rich women might have servants and silk sheets, but they were still trapped in gilded routines. Social appearances, family alliances, arranged marriages, endless children, one wrong look at the wrong banquet, and suddenly your husband's making sacrifices to avert divine punishment, and you're up at night wondering if the dream about the bleeding chicken was a prophecy. It gets darker. There were also nocturnal duties. Roman men expected their wives to be available for intimacy, Consent was a suggestion, not a standard. So yes, you might finally drift off, only to be woken by your husband's interpretation of a Venus-inspired dream. The phrase restless night covers a lot of ground. Then there were the widows, the abandoned, the enslaved, women who lived on the margins, some sold into households as servants, others working in brothels or as night labourers. For them, sleep was caught in scraps, in stairwells, on thresholds, eyes always half open, body always braced. We don't have many diaries from Roman women. Most of their stories are filtered through the voices of men, poets, historians, lawmakers, but in rare glimpses, letters, epitaphs, bits of graffiti, we catch echoes of exhaustion, of hope, of heartbreak. A mother praying her son dreams of safety, a wife writing to her husband on campaign, "I cannot sleep without your voice beside me." Which begs the question, what does it mean when your insomnia isn't seen? When your sleeplessness isn't poetic or powerful or philosophical, just ignored, still awake? Then remember Livia, the one lying in the dark, listening, waiting, holding the world together with one hand while rocking her child with the other. Her insomnia wasn't divine. It was practical. It was unpaid. It was inherited. And it was never, ever hers alone. Let's get one thing out of the way. Not all Romans were crowded into smoky tenements, wrapped in flea-ridden wool, praying to somnus while their neighbours practiced interpretive poetry. Some Romans, the wealthy, the powerful, the irritatingly unbothered, slept in ways that would make a modern spa retreat look like a campground behind a gas station. Welcome to the world of elite Roman sleep, where napping was a lifestyle, comfort was curated, and bedtime came with staff. Start with the domus, the Roman aristocrat's home. These weren't just houses, they were compounds, central courtyards, fountains, mosaic floors, bedrooms, or cubicula, tucked away for privacy, thick walls to muffle the street, high windows for fresh air and dramatic lighting, even sound-absorbing drapery. Yes, they invented acoustic interior design before inventing reliable forks. Inside these bedrooms? Beds that could actually be called beds. Frames carved from ivory or expensive wood, mattresses stuffed with feathers, wool or in extreme cases, imported goose down, blankets dyed with rich pigments, silk pillows, sometimes embroidered with mythological scenes, because nothing says sweet dreams like sleeping on a depiction of Narcissus admiring himself in a pond. And for the truly decadent, there were sleeping slaves. These weren't people who got to sleep. These were people whose job was to help you sleep. Fan bearers, pillow fluffers, oil lamp lighters. One elite Roman even had a slave trained to sing softly until he nodded off. A human Spotify playlist with no ability to unionize. Sleep wasn't just rest, it was performance. Proof of power. You didn't just get sleep, you displayed it. Which brings us to a curious feature of upper-class Roman life, the midday nap. Known as the meridiatio, this wasn't the lazy indulgence of someone avoiding responsibility. No, it was a fully sanctioned, culturally accepted, high-status form of rest. After lunch, which by the way included 3 courses and possibly a flute solo, the elite would retreat to their private rooms for a siesta. To nap, in daylight, while others worked. That was wealth. That was dominant. But don't be fooled. This was strategic sleep. Upper-class Romans often woke before dawn to oversee their estates, receive clients, and lecture anyone who dared to have less property than them. A midday nap wasn't weakness. It was optimization. If Elon Musk wore a toga and sipped watered wine, he'd be tweeting about Meridiatio by now. And yet, even with all their luxury, the elite had their own sleep problems. Wealth doesn't protect you from guilt, anxiety, or the sheer spiritual horror of hosting too many dinner parties. Some of the richest Romans were also the most restless, pacing palatial halls, ordering nighttime foot massages, dictating letters to scribes who just wanted to go home. Pliny the Elder famously wrote that he only needed a few hours of sleep, claiming that rest was for the idle. Meanwhile, his nephew Pliny the Younger complained about being kept awake by the night noises of Rome, though presumably from inside a well-appointed villa with 12 walls between him and the chaos. There was also the matter of dream anxiety. Rich Romans were terrified of bad omens. They hired dream interpreters, burned incense, sacrificed chickens, and consulted astrologers. A nightmare about falling off a chariot, cancel all your meetings, a dream of your father crying, prepare to update your will. Sleep might have come with silk sheets, but it also came with baggage. And if things got really bad, there were drugs. Elite Romans had access to stronger sleep aids, including potions mixed with poppy, henbane, mandrake root, and the occasional opium-laced wine. You could knock yourself out cold with a single sip, if your liver didn't dissolve first. Compare all this to the urban poor, who slept in cramped rooms, shared spaces, doorways, or under the stars. If they napped, it was brief and strategic, in between hauling bricks or surviving festivals. The idea of resting because it's healthy was about as foreign as central air conditioning. Modern parallel? Ever notice how billionaires hack sleep? They hire sleep consultants, track their REM cycles, use temperature-controlled smart beds. Meanwhile, the rest of us are trying to relax with one eye on our landlord's latest email and the other on the ceiling mold. Ancient Rome was no different. Rest, then as now, was another form of inequality, wrapped in privilege and marketed as virtue. And yet, even among the elite, sleep wasn't guaranteed. For every Lucius reclining in a perfumed cubicule, there was a Marcus haunted by inheritance disputes and a burning need to write bad poetry before sunrise. Comfort helped, but it didn't cure ambition, or fear, or the weight of being important in a collapsing republic. Still watching? Then you know the drill. Hit like, subscribe, and nap responsibly, ideally somewhere without political assassinations or boiling aqueduct water. So, what do we take away from this little palace tour? Sleep in ancient Rome wasn't just a bodily function. It was a status symbol, a resource, a message. If you could sleep well, it meant you were winning. If you couldn't, welcome to the club. Here's your tunic and your insomnia. Because in the end, silk sheets and fan bearers can't always hush the mind, and even emperors pace at night. At this point, it's pretty clear that ancient Romans didn't exactly sleep like babies, unless of course we're talking about the kind of babies that cry for 6 hours straight and throw up on your tunic. But beyond bad beds, public noise and divine sabotage, the Romans also faced something eerily familiar: the confusing, chaotic world of sleep disorders. The only catch? They had no idea what they were looking at. To be fair, Roman medicine wasn't exactly famous for its diagnostic clarity. This was an era when your physician might prescribe crushed snail shells for migraines, or suggest a walk in the rain to balance your humors. So naturally, when sleep went sideways, they took a creative approach. Start with insomnia, though they didn't call it that. The term didn't exist in Latin. Instead, they had phrases like vigilantia, meaning wakefulness, or inquietudo, meaning restlessness. These weren't seen as medical conditions. They were symptoms of something else, something bigger, something usually involving bile. Roman medical theory revolved around the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When these were out of balance, your body suffered. So if you couldn't sleep, clearly your humors were rioting. Maybe too much heat in the liver, or dryness in the brain, or an excess of melancholy bubbling up from your spleen like a very sad volcano. One Roman doctor wrote that sleeplessness could be caused by eating the wrong fish. Another blamed vapors rising from the stomach. A third suggested that men who didn't sweat enough during the day were more prone to restlessness at night, which is probably why some Roman men exercised exclusively to avoid dream-based divine punishment. But not all cases were chalked up to humors. Some physicians documented stranger phenomena, things that sound suspiciously like modern disorders. There's a Roman soldier who reportedly woke up every night in terror, convinced he was being strangled by invisible hands. Texts described it as nocturnal suffocation. We might call it sleep paralysis. They called it the visitation of spirits. There's a case of a woman who walked through her villa every night, eyes open, completely unaware of her actions. Roman diagnosis: possession by lunar energies. Modern translation: somnambulism, sleepwalking. Though admittedly, lunar possession sounds more dramatic. And then there's the tragic story of a man who claimed he couldn't sleep because he was haunted by smells. A persistent odor in the nose, he wrote, of decay, of sulfur, of fish. The physicians prescribed herbal fumigations and goat urine, because of course they did, but nothing worked. Today, we might suspect phantomsia, a neurological condition, or possibly just a neighbor with a very aggressive cheese collection. Still, there's something deeply relatable about these ancient complaints. People weren't trying to be dramatic. They were trying to describe something unexplainable with the tools they had, the metaphors they knew, and the medicine that frankly made things worse before they got better. For women, sleep disorders were even more likely to be dismissed or pathologized into complete nonsense. Women who suffered from insomnia, nightmares, or sleepwalking were often diagnosed with hysteria. The culprit? A wandering womb. Yes, a uterus that had apparently packed its bags and gone exploring through the body like a bored tourist. This wandering womb was believed to cause dizziness, anxiety, insomnia, and a general sense of being unwell. The treatment? Scent therapy. Literally. Strong perfumes at the nose, foul odors near the hips, to coax the uterus back to its proper place. One physician even recommended gently vibrating the abdomen, a suggestion that became quite controversially the prototype for a certain modern invention. Let's breathe that in. Or better yet, Roman doctors weren't totally useless though. They knew that diet, exercise, and stress affected sleep. They advised lighter meals before bed, warm baths, avoiding arguments late at night. One physician even warned against reading overly exciting poetry before bed, a truly Roman problem if there ever was one. And they had a word, agritudo animi, meaning sickness of the soul. It wasn't a specific condition but a catch-all for when someone wasn't well and they couldn't say why. We might call it anxiety. They called it a disturbance in the spirit, and they treated it with time, wine, philosophical conversation, and very long walks, which, honestly, is still better than some modern prescription. It's easy to laugh at the mouse fat, the womb herding, the fish vapor theories, but behind the madness was a real truth. Romans were trying to understand the brain, in the dark. They knew sleep mattered, they knew something was broken, they just didn't have the tools to fix it. So, they documented, experimented, invented explanations that, while ludicrous, at least gave shape to their suffering. And maybe that's the most Roman thing of all. Turning confusion into ritual, pain into poetry, insomnia into something worth studying. Because even back then, long before we had sleep clinics, apps or melatonin gummies shaped like cartoon sheep, people were lying awake, staring at their ceilings, and whispering the same question we ask today. What's wrong with me? Not all Roman insomniacs cursed the darkness. Some lit a lamp, sat upright, and stared deeply into the abyss. Not out of fear, but out of choice, or at least, out of philosophical obligation. Because in a society where everything could be interpreted, dreams, stars, bowel movements, sleeplessness too, became a space for meaning. This was where the philosophers came in. Insomnia for your average Roman might have been a nuisance, but for the Stoics, it was an opportunity, an invitation, the kind of quiet torment that if you leaned in hard enough, might just whisper the secrets of the universe. Let's talk about Marcus Aurelius, emperor and insomniac-in-chief. Author of Meditations, part-time deity, full-time overthinker, Marcus famously used his sleepless hours to write long, melancholic notes to himself. Not to the people, not to the gods, to himself. As if he were trying to lull his brain to sleep through sheer philosophical exhaustion. His writings are riddled with half-sighs. You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do, say and think. Comforting bedtime material, really. If your idea of a lullaby is contemplating death while listening to the creak of your soul. But that's the point. For Stoics like Marcus, sleep was not owed. It was a gift. But also a test. Could you accept discomfort without complaint? Could you lie awake and not spiral? Could you examine the nature of fear itself, while your neighbor vomited through the floorboards? Stoicism wasn't about controlling life. It was about controlling your response to it, which made insomnia the perfect training ground. You want to be a virtuous man? Start by not screaming at 2 a.m. when you remember you forgot to sacrifice to the penates. There's a kind of emotional detachment in Stoic insomnia that feels eerily modern. These weren't men clawing at sleep. They were sitting calmly in the dark, arms folded, observing their own misery like it belonged to someone else. Seneca, tutor to Nero, tragically ironic philosopher, wrote extensively about using night hours for mental hygiene. We should examine ourselves, he said. What wrong did I do today? What duty did I neglect? What habit did I improve? This wasn't just journaling. This was nightly moral inventory. It's 3 a.m. You can't sleep. Time to psychoanalyze your entire existence, and try not to weep onto your linen pillow. Still, not all night philosophy was stoic. Some Romans leaned into Epicureanism, the belief that pleasure and tranquility were the highest goods. They saw insomnia as something to soothe with comfort, not conquer with self-flagellation. So while Marcus was writing "Life is short, live with dignity," some other guy was probably in a garden, sipping wine, petting a dog, and saying honestly, just chill. But even the chill crowd had a method. Epicureans argued that freedom from anxiety was the key to rest. That means getting your affairs in order, lowering expectations, and refusing to stress over things beyond your control. Like that fig tree growing aggressively into your neighbor's courtyard. Let that sink in. 2,000 years ago, people were already creating frameworks to explain why their brains wouldn't shut up at night. Already asking the hard questions. Is this a crisis? Or just consciousness? There's something beautiful about it, really. These men, emperors, scholars, senators, didn't just lie in bed hoping for sleep. They used the time. They wrote, reflected, stared out into the stars and tried to find some pattern in the chaos. Of course, not everyone bought into the Midnight Enlightenment model. Cato the Younger, another poster boy for Stoic suffering, was said to use insomnia as proof of moral superiority. "I do not need sleep," he bragged. "I conquer sleep," which is either impressive or wildly unhinged, depending on how many olives he'd had that night. And while these philosophical moments may seem noble, they didn't always age well. Seneca, the advocate of moral nighttime reflection, eventually had to commit forced suicide because his pupil Nero decided reflection was overrated. Marcus Aurelius's son Commodus slept like a baby and became a gladiator-obsessed man-child who nearly broke the empire. So, no, Stoicism didn't guarantee outcomes. Still watching? Then you two are engaging in some low-stakes midnight philosophy. Welcome. The torch is over there. The introspection is free. There's something calming about knowing that even the greatest minds in Roman history couldn't find the off switch at night, that they wrestled with purpose, fate, and mortality, all while wrapped in a blanket that definitely had no button. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the answer isn't always a cure. Maybe it's a conversation with yourself, with your soul, with the dark. So yes, Marcus wrote his reflections. Seneca counted his missteps. Cato scowled into his tea. And you? You're here, listening, thinking, breathing through the ancient noise. Not all sleep is silent. Sometimes it's philosophical. So it's late. Again, maybe you paused this video, hoping your eyelids would finally stage a coup. But here we are, you, me, and the ghost of some Roman fishmonger, who probably also couldn't sleep. At this point, we've dissected the beds, the gods, the weird lettuce rituals. But let's drop the satire for just a second. Because the truth is, insomnia has never really been about just one thing. And more importantly, it's never been suffered alone. Across time, across class, across language and geography, there's always been someone lying awake, staring at a cracked ceiling, wondering why sleep won't come. Rome might be long gone, but its ghosts are not. They live in letters, in fragments of pottery, in scratched graffiti on public latrines that read things like, "I can't sleep, so I carved this," a literal ancient subtweet. We've been able to reconstruct so much about Rome's military, its politics, its plumbing, but the private moments, the silent ones, those are rare, and somehow more human. We have a letter, just a snippet, from a woman named Aurelia, writing to her sister. She says, "I lie awake and count the cracks in the wall. I pray for morning. My bones are tired, but my thoughts are loud." It's not grand. It's not poetic. But it cuts deep, doesn't it? We don't know who Aurelia was. We don't know if her husband was away or dead or just a snorer. But we know this. She didn't sleep. And she wrote that down. And 2,000 years later, we're still reading it. Let that sink in. Then there's Gaius Fabius, a minor bureaucrat stationed in Gaul. His travel journal mentions frequent sleepless nights. He blamed the cold, then the damp. Then finally, in a rare moment of honesty, he blamed his own mind. Too full. It runs like the river after rain. I fear I'll drown in thoughts. Same, Gaius. Same. These were ordinary people. No armies, no temples, just humans trying to make it to morning with their sanity intact. And isn't that still what we're doing? It's funny, for all our modern progress, for all the apps and sleep trackers and magnesium gummies shaped like smiling moons, we still find ourselves here, awake, overthinking, wondering why rest feels so far away. We've pathologized it, medicated it, marketed it, but underneath the branding, insomnia still feels like it always has. Lonely. But the truth is, it isn't. Not really. Not when you know that someone, centuries ago, was scribbling on a wax tablet in the dark, writing down a dream that wouldn't leave them alone. Not when a Roman mother, sitting by a lamp while her baby cried, whispered to herself, "Just a little longer, just one more hour." Not when a slave boy lit the hall torches again, his eyes burning, hoping no one noticed his hands shaking from fatigue. You're part of a lineage, not of rulers or generals, but of watchers, of midnight thinkers, of those who kept vigil while the rest of the world dozed. There's comfort in that. Still here? Still listening? Then know this. You are not a failure, because you can't sleep. You are not broken. You are not weak. You are simply human. Deeply, painfully, beautifully human. And so were they. They didn't have melatonin, or YouTube, or blackout curtains. They had wine, prayers, and a lot of unresolved emotions. But they also had each other. Families, friends, neighbors who stayed up late and passed cups of watered wine to make the silence less brutal. Even strangers on rooftops. Philosophers scribbling by lamplight, widows counting stars, merchants pacing between nightmares, all part of the same orchestra of restlessness. So maybe the goal isn't sleep. Maybe the goal is company. Maybe it's knowing that in every age there were those who walked the line between night and morning, who breathed through the dark and waited, who endured. You're not alone. You never were. And even if your eyelids refuse to cooperate, you're still part of something ancient, something quiet, something real. By now you've seen it all. The lettuce water, the sacrificial poultry, the poppy wine strong enough to tranquilize a centaur. Ancient Roman sleep habits ranged from oddly effective to deeply cursed. But as we start winding this insomniac odyssey down, it's worth asking, what, if anything, did the Romans actually get right? And perhaps more disturbingly, what are we still doing wrong? Let's start with the winners. Believe it or not, the Romans were early adopters of some genuinely decent sleep hygiene. For one, they understood the importance of winding down. The meridiatio, their midday nap, wasn't laziness. It was rhythm. It was built into the culture. Productivity came in waves, not sprints. You worked in the morning, napped, then re-engaged. Sound familiar? It should. Today we call it polyphasic sleep. Or, if you're trendy and self-employed, listening to your body. Turns out, your body's been whispering in Latin this whole time. They also valued bathing before bed. Evening trips to the bathhouse were as common as modern people checking their phones. A social reset, yes, but also a physical one. Warm water, soft lighting, maybe a bit of oil massage. That's basically the Roman version of ambient playlists, and a lavender diffuser. And let's give a slow clap to their dietary restraint. Roman physicians advised avoiding heavy food and strong drink before bed. No spicy eel at midnight, no fourth goblet of unmixed wine unless you were already emotionally prepared to fight your neighbor or compose a sonnet. That's shockingly similar to modern sleep recommendations, which means somewhere a toga-clad doctor was screaming, "No carbs after sunset," long before TikTok wellness influencers showed up. But don't get too impressed, because the list of things the Romans got wrong is longer than the Appian Way. Let's begin with the poppy wine. Yes, it worked. But also yes, it was a fast track to accidental death or addiction. No one was tracking dosage. No one was labeling jars. If your servant poured too much, well, sweet dreams, permanently. Then there were the rituals. Sprinkling ash around your bed. Sleeping with charms shaped like phallic turnips. Rubbing goose fat into your temples. A lot of these remedies weren't just ineffective, they were straight up dangerous. Especially the ones involving lead-based cosmetics and animal dung compressors, which, for the record, absolutely no one needed on their pillow. And while the dream interpretation books were fun, they also contributed to massive psychological paranoia. One bad dream, and you were skipping court, cancelling weddings, or slaughtering goats just to feel clean again. We talk about modern anxiety like it's a new invention, but Romans were already spiraling centuries before caffeine hit Europe. Oh, and let's not forget their favorite bedtime theory. Suffering equals virtue. Sleep was seen as weakness by many in power. If you needed rest, you were soft, undisciplined, possibly grit. This mindset still lingers in hustle culture, in rise and grind slogans, in that coworker who brags about only sleeping 4 hours as if it's a war medal instead of a medical emergency. Still watching? Still lying there wondering if your insomnia is ancient or just the result of reading too many labels on herbal teas? Then you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and let's finish this dream-deprived journey together. Because maybe the point of all this isn't just to laugh at the past, although, let's be honest, rubbing mouse grease on your feet will never not be funny. Maybe the point is to recognize that for all our advancements, we're still trying to solve the same puzzle. How do you rest in a world that doesn't? Rome couldn't answer that. Not really. It tried. With philosophy, with prayer, with poppies, and pacing and midnight monologues. Some of it helped, most of it didn't. And yet, people lived, worked, loved, failed, tried again. The Romans didn't need perfect sleep to build aqueducts or write tragedies, or design absurdly complex undergarments. They just needed some sleep, eventually, and so do you. So here's what the Romans got right. That sleep matters, that it shapes how we think, feel, and exist. That rest isn't a weakness, it's a foundation. They got that part, even if they buried it under goat entrails and anxiety. And here's what they got wrong. That rest has to be earned. That it's a moral reward. That insomnia is a punishment, or a flaw, or proof that the gods are mad at you for skipping temple last Tuesday. It isn't. It's just a glitch. In a brain. In a system. In a world that still hasn't figured out how to be quiet. But hey, you're not alone in it, and neither were they. So, here we are. The final stretch. The candles are burning low. The streets of ancient Rome are, well, not silent, because nothing in Rome was ever truly silent, but quieter. The wine has gone sour. The arguments have dwindled to grumbles, and if you listen closely, even the dogs have stopped barking. This chapter isn't about insomnia. It's about what comes after. The Romans had a complicated relationship with the night. It terrified them, yes, but it also comforted them. It was their theatre, their sanctuary, their blank canvas for everything too scandalous or too sacred for daylight. The night was for gods, for ghosts, and for people like you. People who couldn't, or wouldn't, sleep. Imagine this. It's the 3rd hour after sundown. You step out onto the mosaic floor of your narrow courtyard. The air is cooler now, touched with smoke and fig leaves. A lamp flickers in your hand. Somewhere, a lyre plucks a slow, drunken melody. Someone's trying to seduce someone else on a neighboring balcony. Again, you walk past an old man playing dice against himself. A slave girl dozes upright on a stone bench, head lolling like a half-forgotten prayer. A cart rattles past, its driver singing something wordless and low. This world belongs to the in-betweeners, the watchers, the whisperers, the wanderers, and maybe, just maybe, to you. Because for all its grit and fire hazard architecture, Rome at night was strangely beautiful, soft, not peaceful, never peaceful, but honest. By lamplight, everything is forgiven a little, even sleeplessness. It's no accident that so many Roman poems, letters, and reflections are rooted in the dark hours. Night was when people remembered what mattered, who they loved, what they feared, how much time they had left. The noise of the day made emperors, the quiet of the night made human. This was the Rome that philosophers walked through barefoot, the Rome where lovers carved names into doorposts, where beggars dreamed out loud, where children huddled beneath threadbare blankets and invented stories about the stars. This wasn't the Rome of conquest or power. This was the Rome of being alive. And maybe the most radical thing a Roman could do in a world built on ambition, hierarchy, and spectacle was simply to rest, to sleep. Eventually, they all did. Even the senators, even the insomniacs, even the emperors who whispered their regrets into pillows stuffed with goose down and stress. And now it's your turn. You've walked the streets, heard the gods, counted the cracks in Aurelia's ceiling, laughed at the lettuce juice, felt the chill of the marble floors. You've survived an entire empire of insomnia. All that's left now is to surrender. Let that sink in. Sleep doesn't need your permission. It doesn't ask for the perfect silence or the perfect room. It just waits. Patiently. Like a night watchman leaning on a torchlit wall. Eventually, it taps your shoulder, and you follow. So go ahead. Lay back. Close your eyes. The night belonged to them. And now, it belongs to you. You've heard the carts and the chorus of night poets. You've felt the straw poke through a makeshift mattress. But here's what we haven't touched yet. The ache beneath the insomnia. The part you can't hear through noisy neighbours or fix with goose-fat salves. The part that hums quietly beneath every Roman's sleepless night like a string pulled too tight. Because insomnia in Rome wasn't just a symptom, it was a mirror. And when they stared into that mirror, what they saw wasn't the moonlight or the smoke, but fear. Let's talk about Quintus. You don't know him. He's not in your history textbook. He wasn't important enough to have his name carved into anything fancy. He was a stonemason, good at his job, quiet, reliable, tired. The kind of man Rome was actually built on. One evening his son, 8 years old, curious, mud-stained, didn't come home. He drowned in the Tiber while catching frogs. Quintus never slept properly again. Not because his bed changed. Not because his wife wailed too loudly, though she did. But because every time he closed his eyes he saw the boy's shoes by the door. He saw the space at dinner. He felt the absence stretch across the room like an unspoken prayer. That's the thing. No scroll talks about how the human soul responds to silence. Rome had no counselors, no grief hotline. You drank, or you didn't. You waited, or you didn't. But the ache, Quintus would lie on his back, hands folded over his chest, watching cracks bloom on the ceiling like vines. He'd whisper to the gods. Not the big ones, but the small ones. The household spirits. The ones who were supposed to keep bad things from happening. Are you listening? He'd ask. Are you even real? No answer. So he stayed awake. And that's how it went. For him. For many. Because Rome was a city of ambition, of blood and marble. But underneath it, it was a city of grief, of debt, of guilt, of worry. Fathers feared failure. Mothers feared childbirth. Slaves feared punishment. Poets feared irrelevance. Even emperors, wrapped in silk and delusion, feared death like it was a shadow that watched them from the end of every hallway. Insomnia was the tax Rome paid for being human, and yet they carried on. Every morning, Quintus put on his sandals, tied his belt, sharpened his tools. He carved angelic faces onto the tombs of people richer than him. He chiseled dates into headstones with eyes that hadn't rested in weeks. And when the day ended, he walked home beneath flickering oil lamps, ate stale bread, kissed his wife's forehead, and tried, again, to sleep. Sometimes he dreamed, sometimes he didn't, but he always tried. Isn't that what we do too? Modern life tells us we're defective if we can't sleep, that we're not meditating hard enough, or exercising right, or breathing in the correct patterns of overpriced eucalyptus mist. But maybe, just maybe, our sleeplessness isn't failure. Maybe it's memory. Maybe it's conscience. Maybe it's that ancient part of us that still remembers grief, guilt, longing and doesn't know where else to put them. The Romans didn't have words like trauma or mental health, but they had silence. They had ceiling cracks. They had the kind of insomnia that makes you stare into the dark and wonder who you are when no one's watching. And they lived with it. They still built things, made jokes, ate olives, argued about nothing in crowded forums. They were tired, but they kept going. So if you're lying there now, like Quintus, wondering why your body won't cooperate, you're not failing, you're feeling. Let that settle. You don't need to be fixed. You need space. Space to ache, to wonder, to remember. The Romans didn't conquer sleeplessness, but they endured it. With wine, with philosophy, with rituals both absurd and touching, and with time. Eventually they all slept. So, will you? It's late now, not just for the Romans, but for you too. The night is draped across your room like a woolen cloak, and even the sounds from outside, traffic, wind, a neighbour's mysterious obsession with vacuuming at midnight have dulled. You followed this entire journey through sleepless alleys and herbal mishaps, watched ghosts of emperors toss and turn and listened to the silent laments of people long gone. And now, at last, we rest. But first, one final vigil. Step into the shadows of ancient Rome one last time. The city's quiet now, or at least as quiet as it gets. No yelling bakers, no toga-clad philosophers debating stoicism under balconies, just the occasional drunk staggering home, humming something that may or may not be the chorus of a lost Greek tragedy. You hear the creak of wooden doors, the low snore of a merchant curled up beside his cart, the soft hush of sandals dragging across the dusty ground. You walk not as Roman, but as a ghost among them, past shuttered insulae, past temples whose gods have finally fallen asleep at their posts. Oil lamps flicker behind thin curtains. Someone coughs. Someone dreams. You reach a small room. Yours. Maybe. Maybe Quintus's. Or maybe it's just the memory of every sleepless person who's ever lived. The bed isn't great. Rope-laced wood with straw-stuffed bags trying to pass as a mattress. But it's enough. There's no prayer tonight. No ritual. No poppy wine or sacrificial ash. Just breath. Just silence. You lie down. And in that moment, in that ancient quiet, something soft stirs in your chest. It's not sleep, not yet, but it's the possibility of sleep, the permission, the surrender, the part where you stop arguing with yourself and start listening to nothing at all. Because here's the thing, for all their ridiculous ideas, and there were many, the Romans understood one truth we still wrestle with today. Sleep isn't something you achieve, it's something you allow. It arrives not with force but with release. Not by conquering the night, but by yielding to it. The same way waves smooth a jagged shore, the same way time makes peace with wounds. So here, at the end of this long, restless walk through history, maybe it's time to stop trying. Stop fixing. Stop fighting. Just let go. Let the carts roll by. Let the fire crackle in someone else's hearth. Let the moon keep watch, as it always has, even when no one's looking. Your eyes grow heavy. Your body, once restless, begins to forget it exists. Your thoughts, so loud, so stubborn, begin to melt into one another like candle wax. And then, quietly, you remember, you are not alone. You never were. Quintus felt this. So did Livia. So did a dozen emperors who ruled the world and still couldn't rule their own brains. They all found rest eventually. So will you. Breathe in and out, and if your mind still wanders, let it. Let it drift across Roman rooftops. Let it explore old bathhouses and quiet courtyards and wine-stained taverns. Let it fade into the marble dusk. There's nothing left to fix. Nothing more to learn. The story is done. And now, it's time. Good night. If you're still awake, you're in good company. Ancient Romans would have been too. Hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you've ever tried lettuce juice for sleep. Or don't. Just rest. Because tonight at least, you know the empire of insomnia isn't new.